All right, here we are once again. Now we're talking about adolescence. It's very exciting, and this presentation is about adolescent physical development, and the big theme here is puberty. Puberty is on the list of many people's least favorite word. I guess I can't blame them. It's sort of kind of awful. Puberty. But anyway, that's what we're talking about. So there are some major themes in adolescent physical development, and the ones that we're going to talk about in this presentation involve puberty, where the reproductive organs come online. Sleep is a big issue in adolescence. Stress, sex, and brain is perhaps the biggest issue of all. I think it's even bigger than puberty, but that's why we're devoting a whole presentation on it for the next module. So let's just get started. One of the first things to realize as these gender differences become more and more clear is that height changes quite a bit during this age, and usually right around this time, people reach their peak height. And girls experience their growth spurt sooner than boys. So there's a big old growth spurt that happens right around 11 and a half for girls and at 13 and a half for boys. This matters because there's that moment when the girls are towering over the boys and the poor boys feel like they can never keep up. But if they just wait a little bit longer, they'll get there. Here's a slide that just highlights some of the puberty differences between girls and boys. I'm guessing that most of us know most of these differences, but I wanted to show you this chart here because this shows you sort of how much of girl sexual development is happening sooner than boy sexual development. It just sort of begins faster. You can see that. And then like this little part of the chart is interesting. It just sort of says that it just goes on and on for boys. One thing that is important to realize when we think about children's development and developing into young men and women is when that happens too early. So there are menarche is the name for the onset of a period in girls. And so there's a lot of research about the problems with early menarche or early onset of getting your menstrual period. And here's just some research that I pulled forth from a peer review paper, and it's basically a results table, and it tells us that when girls have early periods, they are at increased risk of depression, substance abuse, and any diagnosis for mental health. And there are a lot of reasons why that can be, because what's happening during puberty, what's happening when, breasts develop and hips develop at the same time that the girls are getting their periods is potentially being seen as sexual beings before they're ready to be sexual beings, and having to live up to expectations that they may not be ready for. But there's also problems with early or rapid puberty in boys. Like if boys become sexually mature too quickly or early, it's usually not as much of a problem in general. But here's one study that found that there actually is a negative outcome, and that is the quality of the relationships with peers tend to decline with early puberty or rapid puberty in boys. Whereas typically, as boys develop at a sort of more normal pace and a more normal time, their relationships with peers usually improve and become closer. So there's something to think about. But one of the things to think about puberty is that there's actually two big things going on. And here's a quote that I got from a psychologist who published in Psychology Today. And the psychologist says, puberty now creates two problems in one. First, it creates a process problem. how to manage the physical changes that are besetting their bodies. This is a problem of self-consciousness. And second, it creates an outcome problem. How to act manly or young womanly. This is a problem of sex role definition. So I like this quote because it organizes like these pressures. The pressures like, wait, what? What's happening to me? Like my body isn't what it used to be. And then there's the pressure of what's being expected of me now that I look different, or even now that I'm perceiving myself to be different. And this could be a good thing or a bad thing, but it could be especially problematic if the sex role that is expected of you isn't matching who you want to be or how you want to be. For example, expectations of girls as being quiet and submissive could potentially be a big problem if the girl wants to be, a soccer player or a scientist in some way that they have to break through different roles. It could also be a problem for a young man who wants to arrange flowers or something that is typically not seen to be part of what's expected of that gender role. And so as you come into like your body, you're also coming into these expectations of the roles. Another big theme in the development of teenagers is sleep. Teens are night owls. They go to sleep later and wake up later, and they need about 9 hours of sleep. There's a lot of stuff going on in the teenage brain that we will talk about later, but one of the things that this requires is a lot of sleep. For a lot of these neurons to be myelinated and pruned, it requires sleep for that to happen. So there are a lot of negative outcomes for teens who don't get enough sleep, and one of the factors that melatonin, is it a hormone? Melatonin, the inner substance that starts a person's sleep cycle, that doesn't kick in for teens until like an hour later. So late teens fall asleep an hour later than early teens. So one of the things that people have started to do is instead of asking teens to wake up so early to go to school, they've started moving the start time of high schools later because they're recognizing teens can't help it if they can't fall asleep because their melatonin isn't kicking in. So if they're falling asleep later, let them stay asleep later and go to school later. And when this happens, I have here some research that did a meta-analysis of different studies of institutions who delayed school time and compared it to institutions that didn't. And what they found is after they delayed, so essentially in this one, the school time went from 8 o'clock just to 8:30. They just moved it by half an hour. And what happened was that the duration of sleep increased by 45 minutes, which is, I find that so interesting because they just moved the start time to half an hour. But on average, the kids were getting 45 minutes more sleep. The percentage of students who got less than 7 hours of sleep decreased by almost 80%. And those reporting at least 8 hours of sleep increased from 16%, only 16% prior to the change were getting 8 hours of sleep. Now more than half were getting 8 hours of sleep. And then students reported more satisfaction with their sleep, and they were more motivated to go to school. They were less sleepy and fatigued at school, and their depressed mood was reduced. And most health-related variables, including health center visits, improved, as did class attendance. So why is this important? This is another example of why developmental inquiry is important, because it's asking, do adolescents fall asleep differently than other age groups? And when they found that they did, they could change policy and improve a vast number of students' lives. So that's a success. Another thing that's a big deal for adolescents is stress and coping. So stress, uh, even though like people think of it as a psychological phenomenon, more and more it's sort of a crossover between psychology and health itself, because there's so many health outcomes and health concerns that are associated with high levels of stress. Long-term chronic stress is associated with multiple diseases and health conditions. Heart, I'm not going to list them here. Take Psych 1 and we'll talk about it in more detail. But there are, and positive coping techniques that are learned early will lead to a healthier, happier life. So it's not just that stress can harm the health of adolescents, but the coping techniques, whether they're negative coping techniques like smoking or drinking, or positive coping techniques such as reframing how you're thinking or developing a breathing repertoire for what to do when you're stressed, these techniques could have long-term effects, because what you learn when you're a teenager can see you through the tough times ahead, essentially. So, just to remind you, a lot of you are either still in your adolescence or recently out of adolescence, but just in case you're not, I just wanted to run through what some of these stressors are, just to remind us about how much stress occurs during adolescence. So first of all, at school, there's living up to pressures to succeed and crammed schedules. And then there's pressures around work. You want to find a job. You may need to help your family pay the bills. There's huge social pressures, including belonging to a group or what to wear, and how can you afford what to wear, and finding and keeping friends. And on social media, now you have to worry about how many likes you have, and do you have followers, and are there retweets, or whatever it is you do on social media these days. Your body image is a big deal. Now you have to feel whether you're attractive or not, and that intersects with the clothes you wear as well. You have romantic pressures, like, do you have a boyfriend? Do you have a girlfriend? You'd better get one. Also, what if you're a boy and you want a boyfriend, or a girl and you want a girlfriend? Now your orientation is in question. How are you going to live up to these expectations? And let's say you have one. Are you going to engage in sexual behavior? And what does that mean about you? And will it get out? And who's going to talk about you? Then there are family stressors, parental inflexibility. Like, the parents won't let you do what you really want to do and you really need to do to get all of these other things that we just talked about. And then there may be major life events that also occur during adolescence, such as moving schools, or someone in your family falls ill. That's really a big deal right now. Or maybe there's divorce, or maybe there's a global pandemic and everything shuts down. Anyway, these are the things that adolescents need to cope with. And so having some perspective on what good stress coping mechanisms may be. I know we looked at this a little bit for pregnant moms, right? What can pregnant moms do to reduce their stress? That same type of thinking is appropriate here for adolescents. So we're gonna do just a breathing technique. You can do it with me now. And it's just something that it's based in science. And the science is that when you inhale, your heartbeat increases. And when you exhale, your heartbeat decreases. And so one thing that we want to do when we're stressed is we want to slow down our heart rate and get back to a level of calm, a level of steady. And so this exercise is simply intended to help you slow down your heart rate and get yourself back in order. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say inhale, and then you're going to inhale for the number of times that I count. And then I'm going to say exhale, and then you exhale for the number of times that I count. Ready? Inhale, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Inhale, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Inhale, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Did you get the feeling? Yeah? I hope you did. It's just something that you can do, and or you could just say, I'm going to extend my exhale, but it's just to give you an idea of how simple one simple breathing exercise can reduce stress in any moment. Okay. Now, another big theme of adolescence is sex. So what is happening during puberty? You're developing the equipment that you need to have sex or attract a mate and satisfy a mate, should you be lucky enough to find one. Although I don't necessarily recommend that for adolescents, because there's a lot of research that says the longer that you wait, the happier you are with your choices, right? So, but what we know is that 70% of Americans have intercourse before age 20. And some things that we want to consider are what makes somebody ready to have sex. And another important thing that we want to consider is, especially when people are thinking about like homosexuality or being attracted to the same gender, like I know sometimes I have students who are very opposed to this idea, and for perhaps religious reasons. But one of the things that I want to just raise is that when you reject a person for their sexual orientation, especially in adolescence, you're increasing their risk for suicide. And so I just put it out there that, if somebody in your life is experiencing an attraction to a similar sex and you reject them for it, you have to understand what your role is in their life, by doing that rejection. Also, another big theme in adolescence is masturbation. And my 2 cents on this is everybody does it. And when it's viewed as healthy and normal and private, it's less likely to become an obsession. So, there's that. Teen pregnancy is going down in the last 30 years or so. It's gone down quite a bit. And so this chart is births per 1,000 females aged 15 to 19. And what we see is that it's gone down for all ethnicities. And it's gone down especially for African Americans. But both Hispanic and African Americans have the highest level of births per 1,000 females, and Asian Americans have the lowest. And that's consistent with things that we've read in the textbook about sort of Asian culture being more conservative about dating. Some more statistics. 40% of high school students have had sexual intercourse. Delaying first sex is related to more use of contraception, and that means less pregnancy and less STDs or sexually transmitted diseases. And sexual activity in high school is declining. So here we have a chart that shows how, especially for African Americans, it's declining quite a bit, such that even though in 1990 it was significantly, the percentage of those who had sex was significantly higher for African Americans. Now it's nearly on par with the rest. Everybody's sort of all hovering around, 40 to 50%. Now, another thing, I would be remiss if I'm talking about sex to not just take a moment and talk about consent. Now, the Me Too movement is 2-3 years old at this point, and there was so much awareness of sexual harassment and sexual assault and rape and And in this conversation, it's important for us to not like forget it because now we're talking about racial justice. Let's just remember the thing that we learned from 2 years ago, which is it's not sex unless it's consensual. It just isn't. It's an assault. And so what does consent mean? That can be confusing for some people. So this isn't based on research. This is just my synthesis from what I have, from what I understand and what I've read is that yes only means yes when there is freedom to say no. If somebody isn't free to say no, then their yes means nothing. Freedom is not there when someone is intoxicated or fearing for their safety or fearing for their social existence, such as being ostracized or rejected or ridiculed in public. That could be a form of coercion. Consent is about total respect for choice, and respecting someone's choice is acknowledging their inner life, acknowledging that the person that you're about to engage with has thoughts, feelings, desires, dislikes, preferences. Once you get your mind around their inner life, not only are you going to be sure not to do something without their consent, but you're also going to have much better sex. In terms of sexual education, like there's some things that work and don't work. And there have been people who have been promoting this idea that, oh, let's just not teach children, our young people about contraception. It'll put ideas into their head. Well, as a developmentalist, I can tell you these ideas are coming into their heads, whether they have sex ed or not. But it's also important to say that this emphasis on abstinence-only sex ed doesn't work. Multiple studies have shown. But here's one that I'm just referencing here. So abstinence-only sex ed does not teach about contraceptives. Adolescents who receive only abstinence-only sex ed were not less likely to become pregnant or engage in intercourse than those who received no sex ed at all. Just didn't do anything. However, sex ed that included contraceptive education was associated with a decrease in pregnancy and a minor decrease in the likelihood to engage in intercourse. Interesting, huh? So there's that, and now you know. Lastly, I'm going to mention that brain development is a big deal, and we're going to talk about that in our next video together. All right. Thanks for listening.